On April 14, 1943, Stalin's eldest son died in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. According to official reports, he deliberately approached an electrified fence. Minutes later, he received several shots from German guards. His corpse was analyzed by Nazi doctors. Stalin, upon being informed, responded with a single phrase, "War is war." Yakov Dzhugashvili was never a protected son. Abandoned by Stalin after his mother's death, he grew up in Georgia without contact with his father. He was rejected, publicly humiliated, forced to live in the Kremlin as an intruder, and despised for his desire for recognition. When he was captured in 1941, Stalin considered him a traitor. When Germany proposed an exchange, he refused categorically. Why did Stalin prefer to let his own son die rather than negotiate? What does his story reveal about Soviet totalitarianism? And what role did Yakov play, victim, symbol, or hindrance? Or forgotten son, Stalin's contempt from the cradle. On March 31, 1907, in the village of Baji, Georgia, a child was born destined to carry one of the heaviest surnames of the 20th century, although he would never be allowed to use it. Yakov Yosifovich Dzhugashvili came into the world when his father, Iosif Dzhugashvili, was barely a rising Bolshevik operative who would later transform into Joseph Stalin. Kato Svanidze, his mother, represented everything that Stalin would abandon on his path to power. Devout and rooted in Georgian Orthodox traditions, she had insisted on a religious ceremony that the atheist Stalin accepted as a temporary concession to his human feelings. Yakov's first months passed in an atmosphere of constant clandestinity while the family fled between Tiflis and Baku to evade the Tsarist authorities. In December 1907, when Yakov was barely 8 months old, tragedy struck devastatingly. During a return trip to Tiflis, Kato contracted typhoid fever and died on December 5th. Stalin, destroyed, expressed words that would reveal his future hardening. "This creature softened my heart of stone. With her death, all human feeling died in me." In a dramatic gesture that his comrades would remember for decades, he threw himself into his wife's coffin and had to be physically separated from it. But if Kato's death was an open wound in Stalin's soul, Yakov's fate became something even more tragic. The decision that followed would forever define the father-son relationship. Stalin handed the child over to the Svanidze family and disappeared from his life for more than a decade. For Yakov, this meant growing up without paternal references, speaking Georgian and completely disconnected from the political world that his father was helping to forge in Moscow. The Svanidzes raised Yakov with love, but they could not replace what he had lost. The child developed a reserved and gentle character with a deep desire to please adults. However, he also began to show signs of the emotional insecurity that would accompany him all his life. In 1921, Stalin decided to take him to Moscow. The reunion was not a loving family meeting, but a cold encounter between a powerful man and an unknown teenager who did not speak Russian fluently. Stalin had remade his life with Nadezhda Alliluyeva, with whom he had 2 children, Vasily and Svetlana. Yakov was incorporated not as a full member of the family, but as an uncomfortable presence. He slept in the living room of the Kremlin apartment without his own room. Nadezhda Alliluyeva, barely 6 years older than Yakov, tried to create emotional bridges, but the barrier erected by Stalin was impenetrable. One of the cruelest manifestations was the explicit prohibition of using the surname Stalin. When Yakov expressed his desire to adopt it, the response was categorical: "You are not worthy of bearing it." This denial was more than a formal rejection. It was the declaration that for Stalin, Yakov was not only insufficient as a son, but dispensable as a person. Despite this systematic hostility, Yakov continued desperately seeking paternal approval. He was a young man who did not rebel with violence but with sadness, who did not confront but resigned himself. In 1928, the relationship reached its breaking point. Yakov had fallen in love with Zoya Gunina, daughter of an Orthodox priest. When they expressed their intention to marry, Stalin reacted violently, publicly humiliating the young woman until she cried. Yakov, desperate from the pressure and humiliation, took a pistol and shot himself in the chest. The bullet missed his heart by centimeters but pierced his left lung. Stalin did not visit him in the hospital. His only reaction was dismissive. "You can't even shoot yourself properly." It was the final confirmation that for Stalin, human weakness was unforgivable even in his own blood. This episode definitively marked the relationship between father and son. From that moment on, any possibility of emotional reconciliation was buried forever. The following years were marked by a distance that became almost physical. Stalin tolerated him but did not recognize him, maintained him but did not love him. This first stage established the patterns that would define everything that would come after. Early abandonment, desperate search for validation, and the painful understanding that his father saw him as a personal failure rather than as a son. Denied identity, the evolution of a son without homeland. After the suicide attempt, Yakov entered adulthood determined to forge his own identity. Each step was conditioned by a cruel paradox. He was the son of the most powerful man in the USSR, but lacked real privileges. His lineage had become a burden that condemned him to constant scrutiny without protection or recognition. At the beginning of the 1930s, he enrolled in the Moscow Transport Institute, one of the most relevant technical institutions for the industrialization plans promoted by the regime. The country needed engineers, technicians, and innovators who would bring electricity, trains, and heavy machinery to the vast Soviet territory. Electrification was part of communism's modernizing dream. Yakov chose that path not only out of academic interest, but because it offered him a path of social integration alien to politics and perhaps a way to demonstrate his worth by his own merits. During his years of study, he maintained a low profile. He avoided talking about his family, did not mention his kinship with Stalin, and tried to stand out solely for his discipline. His classmates remembered him as a reserved, educated, and methodical young man. He did not participate in political activities, nor did he get involved in the ideological debates so frequent on campuses of the time. While others sought advancement through the Komsomol or party channels, he seemed to move in a parallel world without ambition for power. When he graduated as an electrical engineer in 1935, there were no special celebrations. Stalin did not attend, nor did he send a congratulatory note. There were no privileges, recommendations, or exceptional appointments. He was assigned to work in state electrical plants, first on the outskirts of Moscow, and then in industrial areas where working conditions were harsh and expectations demanding. His work consisted of supervising energy distribution systems, detecting failures in heavy machinery, and ensuring the maintenance of transformation stations. In that technical environment, Yakov earned the respect of his colleagues but also their curiosity. Many did not understand how someone with such kinship could move as one more among workers and supervisors without receiving favored treatment. Some admired him for his humility, others suspected that his presence in a modest position was in itself a sign of punishment or distancing by his influential father. Speculation was inevitable, and Yakov knew it. Therefore, he avoided any comment about politics or family. He was above all a silent worker. In his personal life, the years following the suicide attempt were marked by a constant search for emotional stability. After physically recovering, he resumed contact with Zoya Gunina, his childhood love. Against all odds, they married in 1928. But the wound opened by Stalin's initial rejection never fully healed. The relationship was brief and turbulent. In 1929, a daughter was born whose fragile health condemned her from the beginning. The girl died at 8 months, victim of pneumonia. That loss was a devastating blow for both. Yakov, who had placed his hope of building his own family in that paternity, withdrew even more into himself. The marriage did not survive the grief, and separation was inevitable. Shortly after, he maintained a relationship with Olga Golisheva, a young student with progressive ideology. From that union, his second child, Yevgeny, was born in 1936. Although the relationship did not lead to marriage, Yakov assumed responsibility as a father. He registered the child with his surname and remained present in his life despite the restrictions imposed by the political and family context. Stalin, for his part, never publicly recognized Yevgeny as his grandson. The indifference extended not only to Yakov but also to his descendants. In 1938, Yakov married Yulia Meltzer, a Jewish dancer from Odessa who had been previously married to an NKVD officer. This choice, apparently personal, had deep political implications. At a time when the regime was beginning to show growing signs of institutional anti-Semitism, A marriage to a Jewish woman did not go unnoticed. However, Yulia was a strong woman, with experience in power circles and with sufficient emotional intelligence to deal with her new husband's surname. That same year, Galina was born, who would become the daughter emotionally closest to Yakov. Life with Yulia was, according to later testimonies, the most stable that Yakov managed to build. They lived modestly, without great luxuries or public exposure. Yakov found in her a firm companion, capable of understanding his silences and his frustrations. Galina, in her childhood, would remember that her father was a sweet, reserved man who read to her quietly and hugged her with a tenderness that did not seem compatible with the iron image of the surname he could not use. The marriage also represented a small affirmation of independence. Although he still lived under Stalin's shadow, Yakov had managed to form his own effective nucleus away from the impersonal structure of the Kremlin. The choice of a partner with a past in the security apparatus and also Jewish was an act of personal affirmation, perhaps also an unconscious gesture of symbolic opposition. He was never actively dissident, but in his private life he demonstrated that he did not share the logic of exclusion, absolute control, or fear that prevailed in the corridors of power. In 1937, a decision again altered his course: his admission to the Red Army Artillery Academy. For many, this movement was unexpected. Why would someone who had been trained as a civil engineer now decide to integrate into the military apparatus? The answers are multiple, but all point to the same search: legitimacy. Perhaps Yakov imagined that in the army he could be judged by his technical capabilities rather than by his surname. Perhaps he thought that serving the country from an official institution could finally reconcile him with his father. For 4 years, he dedicated himself to the study of heavy artillery. It was a branch that demanded advanced technical knowledge, logistical coordination, and a detailed understanding of applied physics. There, his background as an engineer allowed him to stand out. His instructors described him as a competent, disciplined, but not brilliant student. He was not a natural leader or a passionate orator. He lacked the charisma of great commanders. But he knew the mechanisms of artillery pieces as if they were extensions of his logical thinking. Despite his dedication, the context was not favorable. The academy, like many military institutions at that time, had been devastated by the purges. Hundreds of officers had been arrested or executed for supposed treason. The atmosphere was one of distrust. Students were evaluated not only for their technical performance, but for their ideological reliability. Yakov, due to his withdrawn character, was difficult to categorize. He showed no enthusiasm for the party, but he also did not commit ideological errors. He moved, as always, in the uncertain terrain of neutrality. He graduated in May 1941, just weeks before the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa. His assignment as lieutenant in command of a battery of the 14th Howitzer Regiment was seen as a prudent decision, honorable enough for a competent graduate but without excessive exposure, a position that allowed him to serve without attracting too much attention. At the close of this stage, Yakov had managed to build a discreet, solid professional and personal life without scandals or privileges, but also without paternal affection or institutional support. He was an exemplary citizen but never a recognized son. He had obeyed all the rules, built a family, assumed responsibilities, and yet he continued to be seen as a peripheral figure, someone whose existence was not denied, but also not fully accepted. His story, up to that moment, was that of a man condemned to exist between two worlds, that of absolute power that never opened its doors to him, and that of ordinary life that allowed him to breathe, but not fully belong. In a society where proximity to power usually guaranteed impunity or prestige, Yakov was a painful exception, the dictator's son, but also the forgotten son. In the Wolf's Mouth, capture during Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the western border of the Soviet Union. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. For Adolf Hitler, it was not simply a territorial offensive, but an ideological crusade. He had to destroy Bolshevism, exterminate its elites, and reconfigure Eastern Europe as living space for the German people. The conflict that was opening had no place for rules or limits. For Stalin, the invasion meant the sudden demolition of a diplomatic strategy he had considered masterful. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, had been conceived by him as a calculated pause, a window to reorganize a Red Army affected by the 1937 purges, and at the same time observe Germany bleed in the West. But Hitler never intended to respect the terms beyond what was useful. On the night of June 21st to 22nd, Stalin was torn from his logic of power by the crudeness of the facts. The Wehrmacht was coming for everything. The German offensive was executed with terrifying precision. The Blitzkrieg model was adapted to a colossal scale. 3 army groups were deployed: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group South toward Ukraine, and Army Group Center in direct direction to Moscow. Between the latter and its objective lay the city of Smolensk, a railway hub and strategic point located less than 400 kilometers from the Soviet capital. It was there where Yakov Dzhugashvili's fate would take an irreversible turn. Yakov, recently graduated from the Artillery Academy, had been assigned to the 14th Howitzer Regiment of the 14th Armored Division. This unit, located in the western sector of the Central Front, had the mission of offering support fire against enemy fortifications. Although its equipment included 152mm howitzers, powerful but static, it was completely inadequate to face the speed and flexibility of the German offensive. The panorama that Yakov faced was brutally confusing. The Red Army had not finished deploying, the maps were inaccurate, the orders contradictory, and communications collapsed as the enemy advanced. The training received by young officers was insufficient to deal with a real war, much less one of such magnitude. The howitzers, difficult to move, required calculated positioning that became impossible in the midst of chaos. Soviet divisions were bombed from the air even before having ground contact. Poorly supplied troops retreated without coordination, leaving gaps that facilitated enemy encirclements. The defensive lines, planned on paper, collapsed before being physically constructed. It was in that absolute disorder where Yakov, still in an impeccable uniform, found himself in command of a disjointed battery with soldiers who barely knew which direction to take. On July 16th, his unit was completely isolated near the Dnieper River west of Smolensk. Surrounded by German panzer divisions, without reinforcements, without ammunition, without communications, and without a retreat route, the men began to disintegrate morally and physically. Some tried to break through in small groups, others entrenched themselves in improvised positions. Yakov, a novice officer in his first real combat experience, now had under his responsibility dozens of men in desperate situation. The exact circumstances of his capture remain unclear. Some versions, later used as propaganda, claim that Yakov refused to surrender, declaring, "I am Stalin's son, and I do not authorize the retreat of this unit." This phrase, collected by later accounts, could have been an invention to embellish a forced surrender, or perhaps a real act of idealistic defiance at a moment without escape. Another version suggests that he tried to hide his identity by tearing off his insignia, but was betrayed by a captured Soviet translator, who recognized him and identified him to German interrogators, perhaps motivated by personal resentments toward the regime. A third possibility, simpler and less charged with heroism or betrayal, is that Yakov was taken prisoner like so many others, exhausted, without weapons, without options, in a theater of war where tactical failure was a certainty. In any case, what mattered was not so much the how, but the who. At first, Yakov was processed as one more prisoner, but a few days of interrogations were enough for the Germans to understand whom they had before them: the eldest son of the Soviet dictator. On July 19, 1941, German propaganda announced to the world the capture of Yakov Dzhugashvili. The message was clear: even Stalin's blood had been touched by defeat. It was an unprecedented symbolic humiliation. The Nazi regime exploited the announcement as a sign of the inevitable Soviet fall. German stations broadcast communications claiming that Yakov had surrendered without fighting, and that he was now safe in German custody, away from his father's madness. Stalin's reaction was immediate and devastating. Upon learning the news, he pronounced a phrase that would become historic: "I have no son prisoner in Germany." It was not a literal denial. It was, as so many times in his political life, a declaration of definitive exclusion. For Stalin, a Soviet soldier who was taken prisoner was a traitor. Order number 270, signed just weeks before, made it clear any combatant who surrendered without fighting to the death was considered disloyal. The only acceptable form of not returning to the front was death in combat. There was no exception, not even for his son. The emotional impact of the news was multiple. Stalin not only saw his image compromised before the Politburo, but felt that Yakov, once again, had failed. The bond with him, already cracked since childhood, now broke completely. The capture was not only a personal tragedy, but a political blow that touched the deepest fibers of his ideology. His son, flesh of his flesh, had surrendered, and that, in the dictator's logic, was the same as betraying him. Kremlin officials avoided mentioning the subject. Soviet propaganda officially ignored the news. No communications were issued, nor was there coverage in press or radio. However, in a contradictory decision, Yakov was decorated months later with the Order of the Red Banner. The recognition was silent, without ceremony or public mention. It was possibly an internal maneuver to preserve some honor before the military archives and cushion possible internal criticism. Meanwhile, among Soviet military circles, an implicit message was spreading. If not even Stalin's son could escape the consequences of surrendering, no one else should expect clemency. Yakov's capture reinforced the message of terror that sustained Red Army discipline. Dying at the front was the only honorable exit. Being captured, even without direct guilt, was equivalent to treason. Yakov's story at that moment ceased being that of a novice lieutenant trapped in war. It became a symbol of an essential paradox of Soviet totalitarianism. Being too close to power did not guarantee protection, but impossible demands. Instead of benefiting from his lineage, Yakov was punished with a harshness proportional to the emblem he represented. He was not simply a prisoner of war. He was the living reminder that, in Stalin's USSR, even blood ties could be sacrificed in the name of absolute control. Yakov's capture was not just a military event. It was an emotional, political, and symbolic break. It represented for millions of Soviets the definitive demonstration that the regime recognized no exceptions, not even in its most intimate core. For Stalin, it meant the confirmation of a philosophy that already governed his life. One only survives by being implacable. And for Yakov, it was the beginning of a chain of abandonment, exploitation, and loneliness from which he would never manage to escape. Propaganda coin, Yakov in the hands of the Third Reich. For the Third Reich's propaganda apparatus, capturing Stalin's firstborn was not just a military coup, it was a political jewel, a strategic anomaly with incalculable symbolic value. In a war that was fought as much with tanks as with pamphlets, having the Soviet dictator's son in their power offered an ideological weapon that could damage enemy morale, sow doubts in red ranks, and elevate the Reich's propaganda prestige on the international stage. The news of the capture was initially treated with discretion in the high commands of the Wehrmacht and the Abwehr. They wanted to make sure it was really Stalin's son before exposing the finding. Once his identity was confirmed, the usual prisoner of war protocols were suspended. Yakov was isolated, guarded, and transferred to one of the Abwehr's special facilities, the German military intelligence services, where high strategic value information was processed. The first days were dedicated to systematic interrogations. Intelligence officers expected to find a resentful man, eager to get back at his father for years of contempt. They imagined they could easily mold him into a useful spokesman, perhaps the most effective they had ever had. He would not just be a deserter, he would be a figure charged with moral authority, a living symbol that even Stalin's family had abandoned his cause. But soon they encountered a more uncomfortable reality. Yakov was not what they expected. He showed no hatred, no revolutionary passion, no political fervor of any kind. He was rather a silent, introspective, distrustful man. He responded to questions with clarity, but without enthusiasm. He offered technical information about Soviet military organization that was no longer operationally useful, but he categorically refused to speak about Stalin in personal terms. Nor did he accept elaborating moral judgments or offering ideological criticisms. This refusal was disconcerting to the Germans. They did not understand how someone abandoned by his own father could resist such a clear opportunity for revenge. For them, the lack of cooperation could only be explained by irrational loyalty or fear. But in Yakov there was neither devotion nor terror, only a kind of contained dignity. a line he was not willing to cross, not out of respect for the Soviet regime, but out of respect for himself. The Ministry of Propaganda, directed by Joseph Goebbels, then took control of the file. A long-term strategy was designed. First break him emotionally, then convert him into a tool. To this end, he was transferred to a guarded residence in Berlin, a confiscated mansion transformed into a re-education center for valuable prisoners. There he lived in conditions that, although far from luxury, were notably better than those of a conventional prisoner camp: individual bed, private bathroom, regular meals, and access to censored books. During his stay in Berlin, he was subjected to a constant campaign of manipulation. He was visited by military psychologists, psychological warfare experts, and SD agents specialized in ideological persuasion. They showed him news about Soviet defeats, photographs of Gulag labor camps, selected accounts of purge survivors. They offered him privileges, security, a new identity. They even hinted that he could live in Germany after the war as a protected citizen under another identity. But nothing worked. Yakov listened, sometimes nodded, but never gave in. When they offered him to record radio messages directed at Soviet troops, he rejected it calmly, without raising his voice. When they pressured him with accounts of the Holodomor or minority deportations, he acknowledged the injustices but clarified that his condemnation did not make him a traitor. He did not want to be converted into an instrument. He did not wish to serve anyone. He was a man without homeland, but not without limits. Goebbels, frustrated by his lack of verbal collaboration, changed tactics. If they could not use his voice, they would use his image. They organized photo sessions in which Yakov had to appear serene, dressed in clean clothes, well-fed. Some images were retouched to show him smiling alongside German officers, as if camaraderie existed. These photographs were inserted into pamphlets that Reich air forces dropped over the Eastern Front, accompanied by messages drafted by specialized linguists. One of those texts, falsely signed by Yakov, said, "Dear father, I have been captured, but I am well. Soon I will be sent to a camp for officers. They treat me with dignity." The objective was clear: generate confusion, create a crack in the Soviet resistance narrative, humanize the enemy through a figure close to the leadership. Yakov was informed of these manipulations, and his reaction was one of bitter resignation. He did not protest. He knew he was in the hands of an apparatus that did not seek his well-being or his truth. He limited himself to withdrawing emotionally, to surviving in silence. In the winter of 1942, he was finally transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp to block Sonderlager A, reserved for high-profile prisoners, aristocrats, Allied officers, captured politicians, and figures of diplomatic interest. Unlike the rest of the camp, that section had relatively humane conditions. Yakov had an individual cell, access to more consistent food, and the possibility of walking outdoors at fixed hours. The correspondence he was allowed was censored, but it existed. There he coexisted with a captive elite. British officers captured in previous campaigns, members of the Yugoslav royal family, former French ministers. But his condition as the Soviet leader's son made him an uncomfortable figure, alien to any side. He was not one of theirs, nor was he like the others. The British prisoners in particular treated him with evident coldness. They considered him a representative, albeit involuntary, of a regime they despised as much as Nazism. Linguistic differences further complicated integration. Yakov spoke basic German and Russian. His English was clumsy, partially learned at the academy. Conversations were tense, political discussions were inevitable, and although Yakov strove to nuance, every statement about the USSR aroused rejection. He defended himself as he could. He openly criticized the purges, acknowledged the party's authoritarianism, but also spoke of free education, technical advancement, the Soviet people's resistance. He did not do it as a propagandist, but as someone who had lived that world and who still found aspects in it that he could not betray completely. Over time, he became a kind of ambiguous figure, a forced guest, neither enemy nor ally. His presence was bothersome. He could not be accused of collaborating with the Nazis, but he was not a comrade either. He was a foreign body, trapped in a category that had no name. Additionally, he received occasional visits from German high command who wanted to see Stalin's son, as if he were a museum rarity. Generals, bureaucrats, even party personalities asked to observe him for minutes. They asked him trivial questions, looked at him with uncomfortable fascination, as if they expected his gestures to reveal some Kremlin secret. For Yakov, each of those visits was a mute humiliation. He could not refuse, he could not escape, he could only resist standing. His value as a symbol, however, began to diminish. As the war prolonged and fronts hardened, the Reich's attention shifted to other priorities. Propaganda needed new images, new successes. Yakov went from being a strategic jewel to being a stored piece. They could not use him, but they also did not know what to do with him. Despite everything, the Germans retained hope that when the time came, his figure could serve as negotiating currency. The occasion came in early 1943, when Marshal Friedrich Paulus was captured by the Red Army after the German surrender in Stalingrad. It was then when the first rumors of a possible exchange began to circulate among Reich officers. But for Yakov, that hope was not shared. He did not know that a proposal was being prepared. He had no expectations, no illusions. His life had been reduced to a routine of waiting, a captivity without horizon. He was neither traitor nor martyr, just a man trapped between two monsters who used him as a reflection of their own fears. The father's dilemma, rejection of the offer. The winter of 1942 to 1943 marked a decisive turning point in World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad, which had begun as a German offensive, had transformed into a death trap for the German Sixth Army. The final capitulation on February 2, 1943, represented much more than a Soviet military victory. It was the moment when the German myth of invincibility was definitively broken. But the capture of Marshal Friedrich Paulus also created an unexpected opportunity that suddenly resurrected Yakov's strategic relevance. The Germans saw in the possibility of an exchange an opportunity to recover one of their most experienced commanders and test the emotional strength of the Soviet dictator. The proposal arose in German high command circles almost immediately. Heinrich Himmler, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Joseph Goebbels were involved in the initial discussions. For them, the logic was simple. A German field marshal was a military asset of incalculable value, while Yakov, however symbolically important he might be, had no direct operational value. However, the proposal also had deep psychological dimensions. Nazi leaders understood that placing Stalin in the position of choosing between his son and an enemy prisoner would be a supreme test of the emotional coldness that characterized the Soviet regime. The transmission of the proposal was carried out through neutral diplomatic channels, primarily Switzerland and the International Red Cross. The message was direct. Germany was willing to release Yakov Dzhugashvili in exchange for the release of Friedrich Paulus. No additional conditions were demanded. Stalin's response came with a speed that surprised even his own collaborators. He did not ask for time for consideration, did not consult with the Politburo, did not request additional information about his son's conditions. His response was immediate, definitive, and historic. "I do not trade marshals for lieutenants." This phrase condensed multiple levels of meaning. In military terms, it affirmed that the strategic value of an experienced commander exceeded any personal consideration. In political terms, it declared that the Soviet regime would not make concessions to the enemy's emotional pressures. In personal terms, it confirmed that Stalin had definitively erased Yakov from his effective universe. When the Germans, desperate to recover Paulus, expanded their offer to include Leo Raubal, Hitler's nephew captured during the same battle, Stalin also rejected this expanded version. He was not willing to negotiate Yakov's release under any circumstances. This inflexibility had deep roots in Stalinist psychology and in the logic of the system he had created. Stalin had built his power on the basis of absolute discipline and unconditional loyalty. Making an exception for his son would have undermined this entire authority structure, suggesting that the rules that applied to the rest of the population did not govern the dictator's family. Furthermore, the refusal reflected broader strategic calculations. Paulus no longer represented a significant operational threat to the Soviets in February 1943, but accepting the exchange would have provided the Germans with a significant propaganda victory. The decision had precedence in Stalin's personal history, who had repeatedly demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice personal ties for political objectives. He had allowed the death of millions during collectivization, had executed former comrades during the purges. However, Testimonies from close people suggest that the decision was not made without emotional cost. Several members of the inner circle remembered that Stalin spent long periods in silence, smoking obsessively and looking at photographs he kept in his desk. Vyacheslav Molotov recalled years later that the dictator had commented privately, "The Germans do not understand that I have no son, I only have Soviet citizens." This phrase revealed the psychological complexity of the decision. It was not simply gratuitous cruelty, but the application of a political logic that he had internalized to the point of reconfiguring his understanding of family relationships. For Yakov, the paternal rejection represented the final confirmation of a pattern that had defined his entire life. Since childhood, he had sought his father's recognition, only to find indifference and contempt. Now, at the moment of greatest vulnerability, when his survival literally depended on paternal intervention, Stalin had once again chosen to reject him. German records indicate that Yakov was informed of the Soviet rejection through official camp channels. His immediate reactions were not recorded, but later testimonies from other prisoners suggest that the impact was devastating. From that moment on, Yakov completely lost any hope of liberation. He understood that he was alone, abandoned both by his captors, who no longer considered him useful, and by his father, who had officially confirmed his non-existence. Stalin's rejection of the exchange proposal became one of the most cited episodes as evidence of the ruthless nature of Soviet totalitarianism. It established a precedent on the extreme forms that absolute power logic can adopt, demonstrating that even the most fundamental family ties can be subordinated to political considerations. Death in Sachsenhausen, between suicide and execution. The spring of 1943 found Yakov Dzhugashvili in a situation of total isolation that few prisoners had experienced. Stalin's categorical rejection of exchanging him had definitively sealed his fate. He was no longer useful to the Germans as a tool of political pressure, nor could he harbor hopes of Soviet liberation. He was a man without country, without family, and without future. Living conditions in Sonderlager A had subtly deteriorated after the failure of negotiations. Although he continued to enjoy relative privileges, the quality of his treatment reflected his diminished strategic value. Rations were gradually reduced, access to reading materials was limited, and opportunities for outdoor exercise became more sporadic. More significant than these material deprivations was the deterioration of his psychological situation. The other prominent prisoners had begun to treat him with a barely disguised hostility that reflected both ideological prejudices and frustration over his presence. For the British officers, he represented a regime they considered as oppressive as the Nazi one. These tensions manifested in increasingly heated political discussions that Yakov could not avoid, given the confined space. His limited English complicated interactions, but did not prevent him from understanding the contempt they felt toward him. Administrative records during this period describe his behavior as progressively withdrawn and volatile. He spent long periods in silence, looking through the small window of his cell, but also experienced explosions of irritability when he felt provoked. On April 14, 1943, these tensions reached a breaking point that would prove fatal. According to the official German report, the incident began with a particularly heated discussion between Yakov and several British prisoners about the respective responsibilities of the USSR and Great Britain in the war's development. The dispute escalated when the British accused Yakov and his cellmate of having deliberately soiled the communal latrines. This accusation, apparently trivial, touched a deep nerve in Yakov. For a man who had spent his entire life fighting against accusations of inappropriate behavior, the suggestion of inability to maintain basic hygiene standards represented the final humiliation. His reaction was explosive. He shouted at the British, accused them of prejudice and of trying to provoke him deliberately. The confrontation lasted several minutes, during which Yakov showed an agitation that alarmed other prisoners. When German guards intervened to calm the situation, he turned toward them with a mixture of desperation and fury that none had seen before. What happened next has been the subject of historiographical debate for decades. The official German version maintains that Yakov abruptly left his block during the scheduled outdoor activity period. Ignoring the orders of guards who demanded he stop, he walked directly toward the electrified fence of 2.6 meters in height that delimited the perimeter of Sonderlager A. The German report describes the events with bureaucratic coldness. According to this document, Yakov approached the electrified fence and, without hesitating, extended his hands toward the high-voltage cables. The electrical discharge was instantaneous and, according to technical parameters, should have been lethal. However, the report also records that immediately after contact with the fence, a guard from the watchtower shot him 4 times with his regulation rifle. The shots were made following the established protocol for escape attempts, although the logic of shooting a man already electrocuted was never satisfactorily explained. The autopsy performed immediately afterward revealed details that complicated the official narrative. The forensic examination showed severe electrical burns on hands and forearms, consistent with direct contact with high-voltage cables. However, it also showed 2 bullet impacts in the abdomen and 1 in the thigh, fired from an angle that confirmed they had been made from the tower. Even more intriguing, the medical report indicated that the bullet wounds had been inflicted on a body that no longer showed signs of cardiac activity. Yakov had died by electrocution before being shot. The shots had been made on what was essentially a corpse. This discrepancy has fueled speculation about the true circumstances. The first interpretation considers the facts as a deliberate suicide. Yakov had made the decision to end his life after understanding that he had no possible future. This theory is based on his deteriorated psychological state, total isolation, confirmation of paternal rejection, and growing hostility from other prisoners had created an emotionally unsustainable situation. A second interpretation considers that it was a disguised execution, masked as an escape attempt. This theory is based on the fact that Yakov had lost all strategic value and had become an administrative complication. Defenders point to inconsistencies. Why shoot a man already electrocuted? Why are there no records of previous escape attempts? A third possibility is that it resulted from a combination of factors. In a state of extreme agitation, Yakov could have approached the fence without clear suicidal intention as an impulsive reaction to frustration. The guards, interpreting his behavior as a security threat, would have followed the protocol of shooting. Regardless of which interpretation is more accurate, the death represented the tragic end of a life marked by rejection and political instrumentalization. He had been born as the son of the man who would become one of the most powerful dictators of the 20th century, but had died as a nameless prisoner. The news reached the Kremlin through intelligence channels. Stalin's official reaction was laconic. War is war. He did not ask for details, did not express pain, did not authorize official recognition. However, testimonies from members of the inner circle suggest that the news had a deeper impact. Lavrenti Beria recalled that Stalin had spent several days smoking obsessively and looking at a photograph of Yakov that he kept in his desk. Other collaborators noticed subtle changes. He became more silent in meetings, more brusque with subordinates, and more prone to episodes of apparently unjustified anger. Although he never verbalized regret, his behavior suggested that the loss had stirred emotions he believed he had buried. His wife, Yulia, continued in prison until 1946. His daughter Galina, 5 years old when her father died, grew up without knowing the truth about the circumstances until decades later. His son Yevgeny faced discrimination throughout his life in the USSR, only being able to gradually reconstruct his identity after Stalin's death in 1953. Only in 1977, 24 years after Stalin's death, was Yakov discreetly rehabilitated when he was posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War First Class. However, this recognition was made in secret without public ceremonies and without allowing the family to collect the medal. Yakov's death transcends the specific circumstances to become a symbol of the fundamental contradictions of totalitarianism. His story illustrates how authoritarian regimes can destroy not only their declared enemies, but also those who find themselves too close to power to be ignored but too far to be protected. In broader historical terms, it represented the endpoint of one of the most toxic father-son relationships recorded in modern political history. It was the culmination of a pattern of emotional abandonment that had begun in 1907 and had continued through decades of systematic rejection. For historians of totalitarianism, Yakov's story offers a unique window into the psychological mechanisms that allow dictators to maintain absolute power. His capacity to sacrifice even the most fundamental family ties reveals the depth of dehumanization characteristic of these systems. But beyond its political and historical implications, Yakov's death was simply a human tragedy. The death of a man who had spent his entire life seeking the love and approval that had been denied to him since childhood. His death in Sachsenhausen, whether by suicide, execution, or tragic accident, represented the final liberation from a life that had been an emotional prison long before becoming a physical prison. In the electrified cables of a Nazi concentration camp, he finally found escape from an existence shaped by forces completely beyond his control.